I was gone for 5 days. Just 5. Not 5 months, not 5 weeks, 5 days. And somehow, in that tiny window of time, someone managed to do something so unbelievable that even now, telling the story feels a little ridiculous. When I turned onto my road that evening, I expected the same thing I always expected: the gravel crunching under my tires, the tall cedar trees swaying in the wind, the little cabin tucked back in the woods where I'd spent the better part of 15 years building a life that was simple, quiet, and mostly free from other people's nonsense. Instead, I found a concrete foundation poured directly across my driveway. Not beside it, not near it, across it, the only road leading to my house. I actually stopped the truck and sat there for a second, engine running, staring through the windshield like my brain needed extra time to process what my eyes were seeing. Well, I remember saying out loud, "That's new." The thing about living in rural Montana is that problems tend to announce themselves slowly. A fence line dispute starts with a conversation. A property disagreement starts with a survey marker. Somebody's dog gets loose. Somebody's cattle wander onto the wrong pasture. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to build a structure across another man's driveway. At least that's what I thought. My property sits on a little over 8 acres outside of town called Timber Creek. Nothing fancy, just enough land to breathe. The driveway had existed long before I bought the place. According to old county records, it had been there since the late 1980s. I maintained it myself. Every load of gravel, every drainage ditch, every fallen tree after every storm. If something needed fixing, I fixed it. And for years, nobody questioned it. Then the property next door sold. That's when I met Brandon and Nicole Whitaker. They moved in from Denver sometime in early spring. Nice enough at first glance. New pickup truck. Expensive outdoor gear that still looked fresh out of the packaging. The kind of people who talked about country living the way tourists talk about national parks. The first time Brandon and I spoke, I was cutting up a fallen tree near the road. He rolled down his window and smiled. "Beautiful place you've got here. Appreciate it." He pointed down my driveway. "That road yours?" "Sure is." He stared at it a little longer than necessary. Then he nodded. "Good to know." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Looking back now, I probably should have. 7 weeks later, after my fishing trip, I parked the truck and walked up to that concrete slab. Fresh concrete. Fresh forms. Fresh rebar sticking out of the top. Whoever poured it hadn't even finished cleaning up. Behind it, maybe 200 yards away, I could see my cabin through the trees. My own home, and I couldn't drive to it. That's when I pulled out my phone and called Brandon. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Caleb." I skipped the small talk. "Why is there a foundation across my driveway?" There was a pause. Not a surprised pause. Not a confused pause. The kind of pause people make when they're deciding how honest they want to be. Then he said, almost casually, "Oh, that." The second those words came out of his mouth, I knew this wasn't a mistake. And what happened next would turn a simple property dispute into a legal war that neither of us would forget. The next morning, I drove into town with about 3 hours of sleep and enough frustration to fuel a small power plant. I kept replaying that phone call in my head. Not because Brandon had blocked my driveway. That part was obvious. What kept bothering me was how calm he sounded. Like he genuinely expected me to adapt. Like somehow I was the unreasonable one for objecting. By noon, I was sitting across from a local attorney named Russell Hayes. If you've ever met one of those lawyers who doesn't waste words because he spent 30 years watching people create expensive problems for themselves, that was Russ. I spread my survey maps across his desk. He adjusted his glasses, studied them quietly, then looked up. "You're not going to like my answer." I laughed. "That bad?" "No." He tapped the map. "It's worse for them." That got my attention. Russ explained that the foundation wasn't partially over the line. It wasn't close. According to the survey, the entire structure sat inside my property boundary. Every inch of it. I remember leaning back in my chair and just staring at the ceiling for a second. There are moments when you realize somebody hasn't simply made a mistake. They've committed fully to being wrong. This was one of those moments. Russ drafted a formal demand letter that afternoon. Professional. Simple. No threats. No drama. Remove the structure. Restore access. 10 days. Otherwise, we'd proceed through the court system. Personally, I thought that would end it. Most people become very reasonable once an attorney starts mailing certified letters. Apparently, Brandon wasn't most people. 3 days later, Russ called me. They responded, "Good." "No, not good." That wasn't the answer I expected. According to Brandon's attorney, they claimed their contractor had measured everything correctly. They claimed they had acted in good faith. They claimed there was a legitimate dispute regarding property boundaries. Then came the part that nearly made me spit coffee across the kitchen. They wanted to buy an easement. An easement. In other words, after blocking my driveway, they wanted to pay me for permission to keep blocking it. I sat there silently for a few seconds. Are they serious? Russ sighed. I believe they are. The offer wasn't terrible financially. Actually, it was more money than I expected. But that wasn't the point. If I accepted, I'd be giving away control of the most important part of my property. The driveway wasn't just gravel. It was access, privacy, security, ownership. Once you start surrendering pieces of that, you don't get them back. My answer took about half a second. "No, that's what I figured," Russ said. And with that, we filed. What happened next is the part that still amazes me. Because instead of slowing down, Brandon accelerated. Construction crews returned. Concrete trucks returned. Lumber deliveries started showing up. Every week, the structure grew larger. At first, it was a slab. Then framing appeared. Then walls. Then roof trusses. Every time I drove up to my block driveway and parked shore of my property, I watched their little project getting bigger, like they were daring reality to stop them. One afternoon, I drove over and found Brandon standing near the site, holding a coffee cup. Workers were installing roof panels. The place looked like a garage already. I climbed out of my truck. He looked over. Neither of us smiled. "You really going through with this?" I asked. He shrugged. "Going through with what?" "Building on land that doesn't belong to you." He took a sip of coffee. My attorney advised me to continue construction. I couldn't help laughing. Not because it was funny, because it was insane. And what happens if the judge disagrees? For the first time, a little grin appeared. Small, confident, dangerously confident. "Then we'll deal with it." I drove away after that conversation, but his words stayed with me. "Then we'll deal with it." Like consequences were some distant inconvenience. Like money could solve anything. Like enough confidence could somehow rewrite property lines. Out in rural communities, people noticed. Of course they did. Nothing stays a secret for long. One neighbor named Earl stopped by one evening while I was repairing a fence. He listened to the whole story, shook his head, then said something I never forgot. "Some folks think ownership is whatever they can get away with." At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. A few months later, I realized he wasn't. 6 weeks after filing, our hearing date finally arrived. The courtroom wasn't impressive. No dramatic music. No television-style speeches. Just wood paneling, fluorescent lights, and people waiting for their turn. Brandon sat across the room beside Nicole and a sharply dressed attorney from a large firm in Billings. They looked confident. Russ looked bored, which, strangely enough, made me feel better. When our case was called, the judge reviewed the filings and studied the surveys. For nearly 20 minutes, nobody said much. The room felt quiet enough to hear breathing. Then Brandon's attorney stood and began explaining how his clients had relied on professional measurements, how removal would cause financial hardship, how everyone should seek a practical compromise. The judge listened patiently, asked a few questions, reviewed the survey again. Then he tapped the document with one finger. The property boundary appears extremely clear. The room went silent. Even Brandon stopped moving. The judge looked directly toward him. "You constructed a permanent structure on land owned by another party." Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The judge continued. "You also obstructed the plaintiff's sole practical access route to his residence." I felt something loosen inside my chest for the first time in months. Not victory. Not yet. But certainty. The judge wasn't confused. And neither was the evidence. Then came the ruling that changed everything. The structure had to be removed. Completely. 14 days. Restore the property. Restore access. Or I would be legally authorized to remove it myself and recover every associated cost. As we walked out of the courthouse, Brandon didn't say a word. Didn't even look in my direction. Nicole looked exhausted. Russ slipped his hands into his pockets and nodded toward the parking lot. Well, he said, that's about as clear as it gets. I agreed. The war was over. Or at least that's what I thought. What I didn't know yet was that Brandon was about to make the most expensive decision of his entire life. 14 days sounds like a long time until you're the one waiting for it. Every morning I'd wake up, pour a cup of coffee, glance down toward the road, and wonder if today would finally be the day Brandon came to his senses. Maybe a demolition crew would show up. Maybe they'd start taking apart the structure. Maybe pride would finally lose a fight against reality. Day 1 passed. Nothing. Day 4 passed. Nothing. Day 8. I drove over just to check. The garage was still standing exactly where it had been before. No equipment. No workers. No signs of compliance. Just silence. The kind of silence that tells you someone has already made their decision. By day 14, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of parking outside my own property. Tired of hauling groceries down a block driveway. Tired of watching somebody treat a court order like a suggestion. The deadline came and went. Nothing changed. The following morning, I made a phone call. Actually, several phone calls. One to Russ, one to the sheriff's office, and one to a demolition contractor named Victor Morales. Victor had spent 20 years tearing down barns, sheds, garages, and just about everything else people regretted building. When I explained the situation, he laughed. Not because it was funny, because he thought I was joking. You got a court order that actually lets you remove the whole thing. Yep. Well, he said, that's a new one. At sunrise the next day, 2 trucks rolled onto the property. Victor's crew, an excavator, a dump trailer, documentation ready, court order in hand. The sheriff's department had already been notified. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was final. And somehow that morning felt strangely calm. The air was cool. The trees barely moved. For a few minutes, everyone just stood there looking at the structure. Months of arrogance sitting on top of somebody else's land. Then Victor climbed into the excavator. The diesel engine rumbled to life. And just like that, the countdown ended. The first impact wasn't dramatic. No Hollywood explosion. No giant collapse. Just steel pressing against a wooden wall. A crack. A groan. Then the entire side folded inward. The second push was bigger. Roof supports snapped. Framing twisted. Dust rolled through the air. And suddenly the structure that had caused months of stress started coming apart piece by piece. I won't lie. Watching it happen felt good. Not because I enjoy destruction. I don't. But because every falling beam represented accountability. Every collapsing wall represented consequences. Something our world doesn't always provide often enough. For nearly 6 hours, Victor's crew worked steadily. Wood disappeared. Roofing disappeared. Walls disappeared. Eventually, only the concrete foundation remained. The same concrete that had started this entire mess. Victor switched attachments and began breaking the slab apart. Each strike echoed through the ground. Chunks cracked loose. Rebar bent and twisted. Slowly, the outline of my driveway reappeared. Scarred, rough, but open. By late afternoon, the structure was completely gone. Not relocated. Not modified. Gone. For the first time in months, I could stand at the road and see a clear path all the way back to my cabin. And honestly, that moment felt better than winning in court. Then Brandon arrived. His truck came flying down the road, throwing dust everywhere. The brakes locked up. The driver's door swung open. And for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely shocked. Not angry. Not yet. Just stunned. He stared at the empty space. Then looked at me. What the hell happened? I almost laughed. Not because I wanted to mock him. Because I couldn't believe he was asking. You had 14 days. The realization hit him immediately. His face turned red. You destroyed my property. There it was. The anger. The outrage. The complete refusal to accept responsibility. I reached into my jacket and handed him a copy of the court order. The same order he'd ignored. This authorized everything. He didn't take it right away. Just stared at it. Then finally grabbed it. Read it. And somehow became even angrier. This isn't over. Russ happened to be standing nearby. He smiled slightly. Actually, he said, it's pretty close. A week later, Brandon filed another lawsuit. $18,000. Property destruction, emotional distress, loss of investment, the works. Reading it felt like stepping into an alternate universe. The man who built on someone else's land was now claiming to be the victim. But this time the case lasted less than an afternoon. The judge reviewed the previous ruling, reviewed the documentation, reviewed the timeline, then dismissed the entire thing. Immediately. Not only that, but Brandon was ordered to reimburse my legal expenses. Every filing, every appearance, every bill. There was also compensation for damage caused to my driveway and surrounding trees during construction. When the hearing ended, I glanced across the courtroom. For the first time, Brandon looked defeated. Not angry, not arrogant, just tired, like reality had finally caught up with him. These days, we still live next to each other. His house eventually got finished, properly this time, inside his own property lines. We don't talk much. Sometimes there's a nod. Sometimes there isn't. And honestly, that's fine. The driveway is still there. The same gravel. The same curve through the trees. The same road I've driven hundreds of times. The only difference is that now I appreciate it a lot more. Because for a while, I came dangerously close to losing it. And that's the question I still think about sometimes. If I had simply accepted the inconvenience, if I had driven around the problem, if I had avoided the fight altogether, would life have been easier? Maybe. But would that driveway still truly belong to me? I'm not so sure. So now I want to hear your opinion. Was I right to take this all the way through the courts and force the demolition? Or should I have accepted the easement offer and avoided months of conflict with a neighbor I'll probably live next to for years? Let me know down in the comments, because people seem split right down the middle on this one. And if you enjoy real stories about property disputes, community conflicts, and the moments when ordinary people decide whether to stand their ground or walk away, make sure to subscribe and stick around. You never know what kind of story is waiting just down the road.